In April of 2019, Rebecca Hartwell vanished into the Grand Canyon. 6 months later, rangers found her standing at the edge of Mather Point, whispering GPS coordinates to locations where 3 bodies would be discovered buried in the desert. She had no memory of where she'd been or how she'd survived. The coordinates were perfect, the graves were real, and Rebecca Hartwell had become something the investigators couldn't explain. Rebecca was a woman of patterns. At 34, she moved through her Seattle life with the precision of someone who found comfort in predictable rhythms. Morning coffee at 6:15, exactly 3 minutes to brew. The same route to work, timing the lights on Pine Street so she never had to stop. Spreadsheets organized by color-coded categories that made sense only to her. Her colleagues at the data analytics firm described her as methodical, reliable, someone who could find meaning in numbers that looked like chaos to everyone else. She saw patterns where other people saw noise. Her supervisor would later tell investigators, "Give Rebecca a data set that looked completely random, and she'd hand you back a story. It was like she spoke a different language, the language of hidden connections." But Rebecca's orderly world had developed cracks. The divorce papers had been finalized 3 months earlier, ending a marriage that had been dissolving slowly for years. Her ex-husband described her as becoming increasingly withdrawn, spending hours staring at her laptop screen, searching for patterns in data that seemed to matter to no one but her. She'd lost interest in everything that used to make her happy, he said. Hiking was the only thing left that could pull her out of herself. The Grand Canyon had been her sanctuary since college. Every spring for the past 12 years, Rebecca had made the pilgrimage from Seattle, always alone, always carrying the same worn Kelty backpack with the frayed shoulder strap she refused to replace. She knew the South Rim trails like subway routes, could navigate the Bright Angel Trail in her sleep, had memorized the exact spot where the sunrise turned the canyon walls from purple to gold. "The canyon makes you small in a good way," she'd written in her journal the year before. "All your problems become the right size when you're standing next to something that took millions of years to carve itself into existence." On April 15, 2019, Rebecca drove her rental car, a white Toyota Corolla, into the South Rim Visitor Center parking lot at 7:42 a.m. The timestamp came from a security camera that captured her walking toward the trailhead, backpack over her shoulders, hiking poles clicking against the asphalt. She moved with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly where she was going. The temperature that morning was 52 degrees, perfect hiking weather. The forecast promised clear skies and mild temperatures for the next 4 days. Rebecca had told her sister she planned to explore some of the less traveled rim trails, maybe venture down into the canyon for an overnight camping trip. She'd done it dozens of times before. "I need some time to think," she'd said during their last phone call. "The canyon's the only place where my head gets quiet." By that evening, when Rebecca failed to return to her hotel in Tusayan, no one was particularly concerned. Solo hikers often changed their plans, decided to camp an extra night, took longer routes than intended. It wasn't until she missed her checkout time the following morning that the hotel manager contacted the Park Service. Ranger Michael Santos was working the morning shift when the call came in. 23 years with the National Park Service, 15 of them at Grand Canyon, and he'd handled hundreds of missing hiker reports. Most resolved within hours, someone taking a longer trail, getting turned around, running late. But something about this case felt different from the start. Rebecca's rental car sat exactly where she'd left it. Doors locked, windows up. Inside, rangers found her purse with wallet and credit cards, her iPhone at 40% battery, and a detailed itinerary written in her careful handwriting. She'd planned to hike the Hermit Trail on day 1, then branch off onto some of the unmarked routes that connected to the Tonto Trail system. Day 2 would take her down to the Colorado River. Days 3 and 4 were marked simply as exploration. She knew what she was doing, Santos told his supervisor. This wasn't someone unprepared wandering off the beaten path. Her gear list was professional level. She'd marked water sources, calculated distances, even noted sunrise and sunset times for each planned campsite. The first search teams deployed that afternoon, focusing on the Hermit Trail and its connected routes. The Grand Canyon is a vast system of interconnected paths, from well-maintained tourist walkways to barely visible game trails that wind through terrain that hasn't changed since the ancestral Puebloans carved their roots 800 years ago. A person could disappear into any of 1,000 side canyons, slot caches, or rim rock formations and remain invisible from the air. By evening, 12 rangers were involved in the search, along with a helicopter unit and 2 K-9 teams specially trained for wilderness recovery. The dogs picked up Rebecca's scent on the Hermit Trail, following it for roughly 2 miles before losing it near a series of switchbacks that descended into Hermit Creek Canyon. "The scent just stopped," said handler Linda Chen, whose bloodhound Max had tracked missing persons throughout the Southwest for 8 years. Not faded, not confused by competing scents. Stopped, like she vanished into the air. Day 2 of the search expanded to include additional helicopter sweeps and ground teams rappelling into some of the more difficult terrain where a hiker might have fallen. The Grand Canyon kills on average 12 people per year. Heart attacks from the exertion, falls from unstable rim rock, heat stroke during summer months, but Rebecca was an experienced hiker in good physical condition, and the weather had been ideal. "We looked everywhere a body could reasonably be," Santos later testified. "Every ledge, every water source, every camping spot within a 15-mile radius of her last known location. If she'd fallen, we would have found her. If she'd gotten lost, the dogs would have tracked her. It was like she'd simply ceased to exist." The search continued for 8 days before being scaled back to periodic sweeps and aerial surveys. Rebecca Hartwell had joined the canyon's long list of unexplained disappearances, people who walked into one of the most monitored wilderness areas in the country and simply vanished. But Rebecca's case carried particular weight because of what investigators found when they dug deeper into her background. The data analyst who lived her life in patterns had been exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior in the months before she disappeared. Her sister mentioned odd phone calls where Rebecca would recite strings of numbers, then claim she had no memory of doing so. Her work supervisor noted that she'd been staying late, running unauthorized queries on datasets that had nothing to do with her assigned projects. "She kept pulling up geographical databases," said IT specialist Mark Vega. "Topographical maps, geological surveys, GPS coordinate systems for the southwestern United States. When I asked her about it, she said she was working on a personal project, something about finding patterns in missing person reports." The most disturbing discovery came from Rebecca's apartment, which her sister accessed to collect belongings for the search teams. Pinned to the wall above Rebecca's desk was a large map of the American Southwest, marked with dozens of red pins connected by colored string. Each pin represented a reported missing person case from the past decade. The connecting lines formed a pattern that looked random at first glance, but closer examination revealed something more deliberate. Clusters of disappearances that followed rough geographic progressions moving through remote areas of Utah, Arizona, Nevada, and Colorado. Written in Rebecca's meticulous handwriting across the bottom of the map was a single line. "They're not random. There's a sequence. Someone's been moving through the wilderness for years." Dr. Sarah Kim, the FBI behavioral analyst assigned to review Rebecca's case, spent 3 days studying the map and the databases Rebecca had been accessing. Her conclusion was unsettling. Rebecca Hartwell appeared to have identified a pattern in missing person cases that law enforcement had missed, a series of disappearances across the Southwest that, when mapped geographically and chronologically, suggested the possibility of a single perpetrator moving methodically through remote wilderness areas. "She was tracking someone, Doctor," Kim told investigators. "Someone who understood how to use the wilderness to hide evidence. The geographic pattern shows clear knowledge of terrain that would conceal bodies indefinitely. If Ms. Hartwell was correct in her analysis, we're looking at a serial killer who's been operating undetected for at least a decade." The implications were staggering. If Rebecca had indeed identified an active predator, had she become his next victim? Or had her investigation led her to make contact with someone who couldn't afford to let her research continue? But then came October. Ranger Santos was conducting his morning patrol on October 22nd, 6 months to the day after Rebecca Hartwell had vanished. The early October air was crisp, temperature in the low 40s, with that particular clarity that comes just before sunrise in high desert country. He was driving the rim road toward Mather Point when he spotted the figure. At first, it looked like a tourist who'd gotten up early to watch the sunrise, a common sight during peak season. But as his vehicle approached, Santos realized the person was standing motionless at the very edge of the canyon, toes inches from the 1,000-foot drop. Something about the posture, the absolute stillness, made him stop the truck and approach on foot. She was facing the canyon, Santos later recalled, standing perfectly straight, arms at her sides like she was at attention. As I got closer, I could hear her voice, quiet but steady. She was talking to herself or to the canyon. I couldn't make out the words at first. When Santos was 20 feet away, he recognized the clothing. Khaki hiking pants, now sun-bleached to pale tan, a blue long-sleeved shirt, tattered at the cuffs and collar. Sturdy hiking boots, scuffed and worn but still intact. It was exactly what Rebecca Hartwell had been wearing the day she disappeared, described in detail in the missing person bulletins that Santos had studied dozens of times over the past 6 months. The woman was Rebecca Hartwell. There was no question. Same height, same build, same shoulder-length brown hair, though now tangled and streaked with premature gray. But she looked like a person who had been carved down to essential elements, 20 pounds lighter, skin weathered dark by sun and wind, standing with a stillness that seemed less human than geological. Santos stopped walking and listened. Rebecca was whispering numbers in a steady, rhythmic cadence. 38.721, negative 109.568, 36.054, negative 112.140, 37.283, negative 113.061. The coordinates meant nothing to Santos, but the precision was unmistakable. Rebecca was reciting GPS coordinates with the accuracy of a surveying instrument, each number delivered in the same flat, emotionless tone. She seemed unaware of his presence, completely focused on her recitation, as if the numbers were the only thing keeping her anchored to the rim of the canyon. Santos called out her name softly. Rebecca didn't respond. He tried again, louder. Still nothing. She continued her quiet litany of coordinates, eyes fixed on the distant canyon wall, where the first rays of sunlight were beginning to touch the ancient limestone layers. When Santos finally touched her shoulder, Rebecca startled like someone waking from deep sleep. She turned to look at him, and her eyes carried an expression he would never forget. Not recognition, not fear, not confusion, but something deeper. The look of someone who had been somewhere beyond the reach of normal human experience and was struggling to remember how to exist in the ordinary world. "Ma'am," Santos said, "are you Rebecca Hartwell?" She stared at him for a long moment, as if translating his words from a foreign language. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, I'm not sure. The numbers are important. I have to remember the numbers." Santos activated his radio, calling for medical response and backup. But even as help was dispatched, Rebecca continued her recitation, the coordinates flowing in an endless stream that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious memory. She had been missing for 6 months and 18 days. She was severely dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from exposure that should have killed her weeks earlier. But she was alive. And she was standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon, whispering secrets that the canyon had somehow taught her to keep. Within an hour, Rebecca was in an ambulance heading to Flagstaff Medical Center. But the numbers followed her, an endless sequence of coordinates that she murmured even as the paramedics started IV fluids and monitored her vital signs. The locations meant nothing to anyone yet. It would be days before investigators began plotting the coordinates on maps, weeks before they started digging in the remote desert locations Rebecca had somehow learned to find. And it would be months before they understood that Rebecca Hartwell had not simply survived her disappearance, she had been transformed by it. turned into something between victim and witness, between the living and the lost. The canyon had given her back, but not unchanged. She had become a keeper of locations, a living record of places where secrets were buried in the wilderness waiting to be found. The Grand Canyon keeps its mysteries well, but sometimes, rarely, it decides to tell one. And when it does, the telling comes in the voice of someone who has walked the boundary between the known world and the spaces where people disappear forever, carrying back knowledge that no one should possess and memories that perhaps no human mind was meant to hold. The medical team at Flagstaff Medical Center had seen exposure cases before. Hikers who'd spent days lost in the desert, survivors of flash floods and slot canyons, people who'd wandered off established trails and barely made it back alive. But Rebecca Hartwell defied every protocol they knew. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the attending physician, reviewed Rebecca's chart for the third time in 2 hours. The blood work showed severe dehydration and malnutrition, consistent with someone who'd been surviving on minimal resources for months. Her electrolyte levels were critically imbalanced. Her skin showed extensive sun damage and scarring from exposure to desert conditions. By every medical indicator, Rebecca should have been comatose or dead. Instead, she sat upright in her hospital bed, eyes open but unfocused, continuing her quiet recitation of coordinates. The numbers never stopped. Nurses reported that she maintained the same rhythm even while sleeping, the coordinates emerging as whispered dreams. 35.903, negative 114.751, 34.622, negative 111.889. Dr. Vasquez had called in Dr. James Chen, a neurologist from Phoenix, to evaluate Rebecca's condition. After 48 hours of tests, MRIs, EEGs, cognitive assessments, Dr. Chen's preliminary report raised more questions than it answered. Her brain shows unusual activity patterns, he explained to the assembled investigators. The hippocampus and temporal lobes, areas associated with memory and spatial processing, are hyperactive. It's as if her brain has been rewired to prioritize spatial information above all other functions. She's like a living GPS unit, but we have no idea how or why. Detective Maria Santos, Ranger Santos's daughter, who'd joined the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit 2 years earlier, had been assigned to coordinate the investigation into Rebecca's reappearance. She'd grown up hearing her father's stories about missing persons in the Canyon Country. But Rebecca's case was unlike anything in the files. "We need to plot these coordinates," Santos told her team. "If Rebecca's been giving us locations for 6 months, we need to know what she's trying to tell us." The first coordinate Rebecca had whispered, 38.721, negative 109.568, translated to a location in the Moab Desert of Utah, roughly 30 miles from the nearest paved road. Agent Kevin Park, a tech specialist with the unit, pulled up satellite imagery of the area. The coordinates pointed to an unremarkable patch of scrub desert, indistinguishable from thousands of square miles of similar terrain. "There's nothing there," Park reported. "No structures, no roads, no geographical features that would make it significant." But Detective Santos remembered her father's stories about Rebecca's map, the pattern of missing persons she'd been tracking before her disappearance. "Pull up the missing person databases for Utah. Cross-reference with the dates and locations on Rebecca's original research." The search revealed 3 unsolved disappearances within 50 miles of the coordinates Rebecca had whispered. David Kim, a 28-year-old photographer who'd vanished while documenting remote petroglyphs in 2017. Sarah Mitchell, a 35-year-old geologist who disappeared during a solo research trip in 2018. Marcus Rodriguez, a 41-year-old trail guide who'd never returned from a scouting expedition in early 2019. "Get a forensics team to that location," Santos ordered. "Full excavation equipment. If Rebecca's coordinates are accurate, we may have found where 3 people have been buried for years." The excavation began on November 15th, 3 weeks after Rebecca's reappearance. The Utah desert in November is harsh country, freezing nights, wind that cuts through every layer of clothing, ground so hard it requires pneumatic tools to penetrate. The forensics team worked methodically, creating a grid pattern around the GPS coordinates Rebecca had provided. On the second day, they found David Kim. His body was buried 4 feet down, wrapped in a tarp, and positioned with a precision that suggested military or medical training. The remains were in remarkable condition, preserved by the dry desert climate. More disturbing was the positioning, arms crossed, legs straight, oriented exactly north-south. This wasn't a hurried burial. Someone had taken time to arrange the body with ceremony. Sarah Mitchell was found 18 hours later, buried 50 yards away in identical fashion. Marcus Rodriguez was discovered on day 3. All 3 bodies showed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull. All 3 had been positioned with the same ritualistic precision, and all 3 locations corresponded exactly to coordinates Rebecca Hartwell had whispered while standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon. Dr. Vasquez watched the news coverage from Rebecca's hospital room, where her patient continued her endless recitation. But something had changed. As each body was discovered, Rebecca's coordinates had shifted. She was no longer repeating the Utah locations. New numbers emerged, pointing to different areas across the Southwest. "She knows he's doctor," Vasquez told Detective Santos during a video conference. "Somehow she knows when the bodies are found. The moment your team excavated David Kim, she moved on to a new set of coordinates. She's like a living database of burial sites." The new coordinates led investigators to a remote area near Sedona, Arizona, then to locations in Nevada and Colorado. Each site yielded more remains: solo hikers, nature photographers, researchers who'd vanished while working in isolated wilderness areas. The pattern Rebecca had identified before her disappearance was proving accurate, but on a scale no one had imagined. Over 6 weeks, coordinates whispered by a woman with no memory of where she'd been led to the discovery of 17 bodies buried across 4 states. The victims spanned a decade, all fitting the same profile: experienced outdoors people who'd been working or traveling alone in remote areas. The methodical burial pattern was consistent: 4 feet deep, wrapped in tarps, positioned north-south with arms crossed. "We're dealing with someone who's been killing systematically for at least 10 years, Detective Santos briefed her superiors. "Someone with extensive wilderness knowledge, access to remote locations, and the ability to move bodies without detection. But we still don't know how Rebecca Hartwell fits into this. Is she a victim who survived? A witness? Something else?" Dr. Chen's continued neurological assessments of Rebecca revealed even more disturbing findings. Her brain activity suggested she was accessing memories that weren't her own, as if she'd somehow absorbed information about locations and events she'd never experienced directly. "In psychiatric literature, we have cases of people who claim to remember events from other people's lives," Dr. Chen explained. "But Rebecca's case is different. She's not describing experiences. She's providing precise geographical coordinates. This suggests access to spatial memory that doesn't belong to her own lived experience." The breakthrough came when Rebecca began speaking about something other than coordinates. Dr. Vasquez was conducting her evening rounds when she heard Rebecca's voice change. Instead of the flat recitation of numbers, Rebecca was speaking in full sentences for the first time since her rescue. "The cold place," Rebecca whispered. "Underground. He keeps them there before they sleep outside. I can see it. Stone walls, water dripping. The sound echoes." Dr. Vasquez immediately called Detective Santos. Within an hour, FBI agents were at Rebecca's bedside with recording equipment, hoping to capture whatever memories were surfacing from her missing 6 months. "Rebecca," Detective Santos said gently, "can you tell us about the cold place?" Rebecca's eyes remained closed, but her voice was clearer than it had been since her rescue. "Stone quarry, abandoned. Water in the bottom, green and still. He brings them there first, shows them the others, makes them understand what they'll become. He talks to them about patterns, about how the landscape needs guardians." The description sent investigators back to Rebecca's original research: the map in her apartment with its pattern of disappearances. One location that had been circled but not connected to the other sites was an abandoned limestone quarry in southern Utah, roughly 60 miles from the first burial site. Satellite reconnaissance of the quarry showed a flooded pit surrounded by vertical stone walls, a natural prison where someone could hold people without risk of escape. More significantly, thermal imaging revealed what appeared to be a campsite with recent activity. Someone was using the quarry as a base of operations. The raid was conducted at dawn on December 3rd, 2 months after Rebecca's reappearance. FBI tactical teams approached the quarry from multiple angles, expecting to find either an active crime scene or another burial site. Instead, they found Thomas Whitman, 73 years old, a retired mining engineer who'd lived alone in the Utah wilderness for 15 years. His campsite was meticulously organized, military surplus equipment, detailed topographical maps, journals filled with careful observations about weather patterns, wildlife movements, and the locations of remote burial sites that matched every coordinate Rebecca had whispered. Whitman didn't resist arrest. When agents approached his camp, he was sitting beside a small fire reading from a leather-bound journal. He looked up as they surrounded him, his expression showing neither surprise nor fear, only a kind of tired satisfaction. "I wondered when she'd lead you here," he said quietly. "I knew giving her back would eventually bring this moment, but the pattern had to be completed. The landscape needed its guardians." In Whitman's journals, investigators found the full scope of his decade-long killing spree. He'd been selecting victims based on what he called spatial sensitivity, people who worked alone in wilderness areas, who understood landscape and navigation, who could serve as what he termed permanent observers of remote locations. They weren't random killings, Detective Santos explained to the media. Whitman believed he was creating a network of guardians buried at specific coordinates throughout the Southwest. He thought he was protecting the wilderness by positioning bodies at locations where they could watch over the landscape forever. But the most disturbing discovery was Whitman's final journal entry, written the day before Rebecca's rescue. The woman understood the pattern better than the others. She came to me already knowing what the landscape needed. I kept her longer, showed her more locations, taught her to see the connections between all the guardian sites. When I released her, she carried the complete map in her memory. She became the final guardian, not buried, but living, walking between the buried ones and the above-ground world, carrying their locations in her voice. The pattern is complete. Rebecca had not escaped from Thomas Whitman. She had been released by him, transformed into something between victim and accomplice, carrying the locations of his victims as a form of living memory. Her 6 months in captivity had been spent learning the coordinates of every burial site, absorbing the geographical pattern of his decade-long killing spree. He used her as a human GPS, Dr. Chen concluded. Whitman understood that eventually someone would notice the disappearance pattern, so he created Rebecca as his insurance policy. She would lead investigators to all the burial sites, ensuring that his guardians would be found and his work would be remembered. The psychiatric evaluation of Thomas Whitman revealed a man whose understanding of landscape and isolation had twisted into something approaching religious fervor. He genuinely believed he was performing a sacred duty, populating remote wilderness areas with permanent human presence. The victims weren't murdered in his mind. They were converted into eternal observers, given roles as guardians of places too beautiful and remote to remain unwitnessed. Thomas Whitman was sentenced to 17 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. He died in prison 14 months later, reportedly while drawing detailed maps of wilderness areas he'd never visited, still planning guardian placements for locations across the American West. Rebecca Hartwell's recovery took 18 months of intensive therapy. The coordinates eventually stopped flowing from her lips, but her memory of the locations remained perfect. She worked with investigators to identify 3 additional burial sites that Whitman had mentioned in his journals but never recorded precisely. Every location proved accurate. Dr. Vasquez published her case study of Rebecca's condition in the Journal of Traumatic Memory, describing what she termed cartographic absorption syndrome, the apparent ability to internalize and retain geographical information under extreme psychological stress. Rebecca's case remained unique in psychiatric literature. Rebecca never returned to Seattle. She moved to a small town in Colorado, far from any major wilderness areas, and found work as a librarian. Her colleagues described her as quiet, reliable, someone who seemed more comfortable with books than people. She never hiked alone again. But on certain evenings, residents of her new town would see her standing in her backyard, facing west toward the mountains, her lips moving silently. If you listened carefully, you could sometimes catch fragments of what she was saying. Not coordinates anymore, but something that sounded like prayers, or perhaps conversations with people who could no longer answer. The 17 victims found through Rebecca's coordinates were returned to their families for burial. Memorial services were held across 4 states. At each service, family members spoke about sons and daughters, husbands and wives who had sought beauty and solitude in wilderness areas and found instead a man who believed landscape needed human sacrifice to maintain its spiritual integrity. Detective Santos kept Rebecca's original map, the one found in her Seattle apartment with its red pins and connecting strings. The pattern was complete now. Every pin corresponded to a burial site. Every string traced a line of movement through Thomas Whitman's decade of killing. The randomness Rebecca had refused to accept had been revealed as methodical planning by a man who saw wilderness as sacred space requiring human guardians. But questions remained. How had Rebecca identified the pattern when law enforcement had missed it? What had drawn her to the Grand Canyon at the exact moment when her investigation was becoming dangerous? And most troubling, had she somehow been in contact with Whitman before her disappearance, or had her research simply led her to cross paths with a killer who saw in her the perfect final guardian for his network of burial sites? The Grand Canyon continues to draw people seeking solitude, beauty, challenge, transformation. Rangers still find the occasional hiker who's wandered off established trails, dehydrated and confused, but fundamentally unchanged by their experience. The canyon tests people, sometimes harshly, but it typically returns them as themselves. Rebecca Hartwell was different. The canyon had accepted her offering of disappearance and returned something new. A woman who carried the locations of the dead in her memory, who had been transformed from seeker to keeper, from someone looking for patterns to someone who had become pattern herself. On quiet mornings at Mather Point, where Rebecca was found whispering coordinates to the canyon walls, park rangers sometimes report hearing voices carried on the wind, not distinct words, but the rhythm of numbers being recited with mechanical precision. Whether this is memory, wishful thinking, or something else, no one can say. The canyon keeps its secrets, but occasionally it shares them through people who have ventured too far into the spaces between the mapped world and the wilderness beyond human comprehension. Rebecca Hartwell walked that boundary and returned carrying knowledge that perhaps no living person should possess. The precise locations where solitude seekers had been converted into permanent guardians of landscape that Thomas Whitman believed required human witness to remain sacred. The coordinates have been verified, the bodies have been found, the killer has been captured. But the questions that drew Rebecca Hartwell into the investigation remain. How much darkness can hide in places of beauty? How many secrets are buried beneath landscapes that seem untouched by human presence? And what does it mean to seek solitude in wilderness areas where other seekers have vanished, becoming permanent residents of places they came only to visit? The canyon offers no answers, only silence. And sometimes, on mornings when the wind moves just right across the rim, the faint sound of numbers being whispered to stone walls that have heard everything and remember it all.